During a routine morning run, the Navy SEAL hears a faint cry from inside a trash bin, and what he finds inside will change everything. At the hospital, a powerful woman claims the child, but trembling hands leave secret sign. That sign leads a SEAL and his dog into a hidden lab of restraints and betrayal. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Cold ocean wind rolled through Redwood Cove at dawn, carrying the smell of salt, wet asphalt, and forgotten things. The town was still half asleep, its streets empty except for one man and one dog moving steadily along the edge of the harbor. Ethan Cole ran with controlled breaths, not chasing speed but silence, not training his body but trying to quiet his mind. Leave had never felt like rest. It felt like borrowed time. Ranger stayed beside him without command, matching his pace with instinct rather than discipline. They had run together through far worse terrain than this quiet seaside town, and even here the past never truly stayed behind. Ethan had learned long ago that calm moments were often just pauses between storms. Redwood Cove was peaceful on the surface, too peaceful. Neat houses, closed storefronts, fog lifting slowly off the water, yet something in the air felt wrong to him, the same way it had felt wrong on missions that later turned into ambushes. Ranger felt it too. The dog's movement changed first, barely noticeable, just a shift in rhythm, a tension that crept into his steps. They passed the old market near the docks, the one that had shut down after a fire years ago. Behind it was an alley people pretended not to see. Ranger stopped, not abruptly, not with alarm. He just stopped as if the ground itself had told him to. Ethan slowed, instinct already rising before thought could shape it. The alley was narrow, damp, and cluttered with dumpsters and broken crates. At the far end stood a single trash bin, lid slightly ajar, one corner bent inward. The dog let out a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, something closer to recognition. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He had opened too many doors like this before, too many rooms where the air was wrong, where silence meant suffering. He moved closer and placed a steadying hand on Ranger's back. The lid was heavier than it looked. When he lifted it, the world shifted. Inside the bin, wrapped in filth and cold and darkness, was a child, barely 5 years old, small arms bound with thin cord, mouth dry and cracked, skin cold to the touch, bruises blooming faintly beneath dirt and fear. The boy didn't cry. He didn't move. Only his eyes flickered open, wide with the kind of terror that learns not to scream. Something inside Ethan fractured quietly. Training told him what to do. Heart tried to tell him to stop everything. He cut the cord with trembling hands that had once disarmed explosives without shaking. He pulled the child into his arms, wrapping him against his chest, blocking out the cold. The boy smelled of waste and fear and abandonment. Ranger moved closer, not touching, just breathing near the boy's face, slow and steady, as if offering borrowed calm. Ethan ran. He ran faster than he had in months. Past the dock, past the closed diner, past the lifeless early morning streets. The hospital stood at the far edge of town, lights already glowing in pale morning, yellow. When he burst through the doors, alarm flared across the waiting room. Nurses moved. Questions flew. He gave only what mattered. Child bound, unconscious, alley behind the old market. Time folded inward after that. Hallways, machines, clean hands replacing his filthy ones, warmth replacing cold. Ranger waited without command near the wall, eyes never leaving the small body on the gurney. Ethan stood frozen beside them both, breathing shallow, his mind replaying every unseen hand that had touched that child before he ever reached the trash bin. A doctor finally spoke words Ethan had waited his entire career to hear. Stable for now, dehydrated, malnourished, trauma unspecified, alive, alive. Ethan lowered himself into a chair he hadn't realized he was leaning toward. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's knee, grounding him back into the present. It was less than an hour later when the woman arrived. Everything about her moved too smoothly for a place built on suffering and slow recovery. She spoke with practiced control, carried documents already prepared, legal language shaped like weapons disguised as formality. Her name was Veronica Hale. She identified herself as the child's legal guardian. Her voice did not tremble. Her questions did not waver. She thanked the staff. She thanked Ethan. Ethan did not thank her back. He watched the boy through the glass as Veronica spoke. The child lay still under thin blankets, eyes half open. The moment he saw her through the doorway, his breathing changed. Small, erratic. Fear did what no illness had managed, pulled him inward. Ethan saw the moment the boy decided silence was safer than sound. There were rules even Ethan could not break. The paperwork was real, the authority was real, and the boy, legally, was not his. When they prepared to take him, Ethan stepped closer without thinking. The nurse placed the child carefully into Veronica's arms. The boy's fingers twitched weakly. Ethan noticed a faint stain on one piece of cloth wrapping his small hand, a dark rust red, half-dried. The child's eyes found Ethan's, not pleading, not crying, just searching. As Veronica turned, the boy shifted, barely a movement at all. Something brushed against Ethan's chest near the pocket of his jacket. He felt it, but did not react. He only realized later what had been given. They left. The hallway returned to its hollow buzz. The doctor spoke quietly about recovery time, about observation, about follow-up that sounded like lies even as they were spoken truthfully. Ethan listened without hearing. Ranger watched the door long after it closed. Minutes passed, then more. Ethan finally reached into his pocket. His fingers touched cloth that did not belong to him. A small piece of fabric, torn, darkened with blood, folded tightly, deliberately hidden. A silent message that required no language. Ranger's ears lifted slightly. Ethan stood. Outside, the fog had begun to burn away in thin streaks of light. The town carried on unaware that something violent had just brushed past its edges and disappeared again behind legal smiles and calm voices. Ethan looked at the closed hospital doors and then down at the blood-stained fabric in his palm. He had seen this before, in war zones where civilians learned to beg without sound, where children learned that silence was the only shield adults left them. Whatever had placed that child inside a trash bin had not ended at the hospital doors. It had only followed different rules now. Ethan closed his hand around the cloth. Ranger rose beside him without command. Their reflection briefly appeared in the glass doors, two figures standing at the threshold between order and what festered beneath it. Ethan did not speak. He did not promise anything out loud, but inside him, something older than duty, older than command, had already locked onto its target. And this time, it was not a mission handed down by command. It was personal. The hospital corridor had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Fluorescent lights humming softly, shoes whispering across vinyl floors, distant monitors beeping with mechanical patience. But for Ethan, the air felt heavier, as if the absence of the child had pulled oxygen from the room. Ranger remained near the glass doors long after Veronica Hale had disappeared with the boy, watching reflected shadows fade in the polished surface, as if memory itself were replaying the moment over and over. Ethan stood with the blood-stained cloth hidden in his palm, its warmth long gone, but its meaning burning sharply beneath his skin. The woman had moved with too much control, too much certainty for a place built around fragility and recovery, and the child's sudden fear when he saw her was not the fear of illness, but the fear of recognition. Ethan had learned the difference in places where children learn to read danger before they learn to read words. A nurse named Clara approached him with careful steps, her voice gentle in the way people speak when they sense history behind silence, and asked if he was family. And when he said no, she hesitated and said the woman's paperwork had been impeccable. Court-sealed adoption records, emergency medical authority already signed, everything precise, everything polished, the kind of precision that only money or long preparation could buy. Ethan thanked her and left before she could ask more, Ranger pacing beside him as they stepped back into the pale daylight, where fog thinned into drifting ribbons above the harbor road. Outside the hospital, the town moved as if nothing had shifted. Fishermen unloading crates, a delivery truck rattling past, an elderly man sweeping sea salt from his storefront, and yet Ethan felt the wrongness hanging over the street like an unseen storm front. He did not drive home. Instead, he walked the length of the harbor with Ranger at his side, replaying every fragment of the morning, the way the woman's eyes had measured him, the way her voice stayed level when she spoke the boy's name, the way the boy's fingers had trembled against his jacket as the cloth was hidden there. He used a payphone outside a bait shop that still smelled faintly of yesterday's catch and called an old friend from a different life, a man named Mark Donnelly, who now wore a detective's badge in a nearby county. Mark had once stood beside him in a border raid that ended with 3 men bleeding in the dust and 1 child pulled from a locked room alive, and that night had shaped both of them in quiet, irreversible ways. When Mark answered, Ethan did not waste words. He told him about the trash bin, the woman, the paperwork, the blood. Mark listened without interruption and then said he would quietly pull what he could on Veronica Hale, but warned that the name already carried weight in places men like them did not usually tread. By late afternoon, the call came back. The woman was wealthy, deeply invested in real estate and medical ventures across 3 states, known publicly as a patron of pediatric research foundations, known privately by whispers no one had ever pinned to paper. There were sealed civil cases involving former employees, non-disclosure agreements thick as concrete walls, and exactly 1 old psychiatric evaluation buried under decades of legal dust that no one could now access without a judge's signature. Ethan thanked him and hung up, his certainty hardening into focus. That certainty followed him into the evening as he returned to the alley behind the burned market, kneeling beside the trash bin where the morning had split open like a wound. He studied the ground the way he once studied footprints in desert sand, the way tire marks curved faintly against damp pavement, the way stray threads clung to bent metal. Veronica's car had been expensive, quiet, and recent, The marks confirmed it had idled only briefly, not long enough to suggest hesitation. Whoever had placed the child inside had done so with speed, not doubt. Ranger moved slowly around the perimeter, not searching wildly, but reading old fear the way only animals could, pausing at points where scent grew sharper, then faded, then twisted into the wider city. Whatever trail existed had been deliberately broken. That did not make it disappear. It only meant someone knew enough to try to hide it. As darkness settled, Ethan returned to his small rental near the bluff, a place that still felt borrowed rather than owned, the walls bare, the quiet louder than gunfire. He washed his hands until the water ran cold and the skin reddened, but the smell of the child's fear still seemed to cling to him. When he finally unfolded the cloth under the lamplight, he saw that it was a piece of bandage dressing torn roughly, the kind used in medical kits. The blood old enough to darken, but not old enough to belong to the alley. It had come from somewhere else, somewhere controlled, somewhere clean enough to use sterile wraps before binding a child. Ethan placed it back into his pocket with deliberate care, as if acknowledging a pact made without words. Sleep came late and shallow, broken by fragments that were not memories, but warnings. Before dawn, he woke with purpose already set, the kind that did not need debate. He studied maps of the outskirts of town, property lines that crept along wooded ridges, shell companies that hid ownership behind layers of legal mirrors. One estate stood apart, south of Redwood Cove, where forest met cliff in a sweep of shadowed land, privately gated, medical annex listed under one of Veronica Hale's foundations. Ranger lifted his head when Ethan stood, already sensing trajectory long before commands were formed. They moved before first light, keeping to secondary roads, the sea fading behind them as trees thickened and the air cooled into the hush of inland forest. From a rise above the property, Ethan observed the compound in stillness, a mansion-like residence, with a detached lower structure partly buried into the slope, windows narrow, lights dim even at morning's edge. Vehicles entered with routine scripted timing, not random, not careless. This was not a home built for comfort alone, it was built for control. Ethan did not trespass, not yet. He memorized patterns, rotated entry times, the spacing between guards that pretended to be private security and yet moved with professional consistency. Ranger stayed low beside him, reading what Ethan could only guess at, breathing slow as if synchronizing to a longer, quieter war. By the time they withdrew, the plan was not yet a plan but a direction, and sometimes direction was more powerful than certainty. As they returned toward town, the sun broke fully over the trees and light spilled across the road in gold bands that felt strangely misplaced given the weight anchored inside Ethan's chest. At the edge of the harbor, he paused once more, looking out across the water where everything appeared normal. Fishermen shouting, gulls circling, a child laughing somewhere distant and unseen. He felt the thin, cruel divide between what people saw and what they chose not to. Somewhere behind steel gates and legal seals, a boy who had learned silence too early now belonged again to a woman whose calm had the texture of danger. Ethan rested his hand briefly on Ranger's shoulder, and though he said nothing aloud, the choice was already spoken between them. What had begun in a trash bin would not end in paperwork, and somewhere beyond the shadows of ownership and locked rooms waited the truth that Chapter 3 would not allow to remain hidden. Night settled over the forest south of Redwood Cove with a low coastal wind carrying the scent of pine and sea salt. The estate of Veronica Hale resting behind tall iron gates like a polished thought that no one was meant to question. Ethan watched from the tree line as lights shifted slowly across the manicured grounds, guards following patterns that only looked casual to those who had never mapped danger for a living. Ranger stayed low beside him, breath steady, remembering other nights like this in deserts far from the sound of waves when stillness meant survival rather than peace. The longer Ethan observed the property, the clearer it became that the surface illusion of elegance was held together by discipline, surveillance, and routine obedience. This was not the home of a woman seeking quiet refuge. This was the outer skin of control. He waited until the last rotation passed near the south perimeter before moving, slipping through trees and shadow until he reached the limestone edge where the slope swallowed the lower structure of the estate. Ranger followed without command, reading the rhythm of the guards through vibration and sound. From this angle, the estate revealed its second face, a narrow service entrance half carved into the hillside, its existence meant for those who worked below the visible layers of wealth. The door was locked, but not alarmed, an oversight that spoke of confidence rather than carelessness. Ethan forced it open just enough to pass through, sealing it again behind them without sound. Inside, the air was colder than expected, sterile in a way that erased the scent of home and replaced it with metal and chemical memory. The corridor slanted downward into a space the architects had clearly intended to hide. Overhead, lights hummed faintly as if resisting being awake, and the walls grew thicker with each measured step. Ethan, moved with caution, learned from years of rooms that killed before they revealed themselves. Ranger's body shifted as the air changed, not with fear, but with recognition. The same recognition he had shown near the trash bin and the estate gates alike. The first room they entered had once been presented as storage. Now it held restraint equipment that had never belonged to boxes or furniture. The shapes were unmistakable, manacles sized for small wrists, straps bolted into concrete, a padded surface angled like a medical table but scarred with repeated use. Ethan's jaw tightened as memory overlapped with present sight, old mission sites blending with new civilian evil. Nothing here resembled treatment. Everything resembled preparation. The second room confirmed it. Cabinets lined the walls, each filled with syringes carefully labeled with dosages that did not belong to children, sedatives, muscle suppressors, agents meant to dull resistance, not heal disease. The refrigerator at the far end housed vials arranged with the reverent precision of ritual, and in the center, under a single cone of light, stood a steel cage tall enough for a child to stand and narrow enough to teach the body helplessness before the mind surrendered. Ranger let out a low sound then, not a growl, not fear, but the same wounded understanding he had shown at the alley, a recognition of suffering that belonged to his kind long before it belonged to ours. Ethan moved on before anger could cloud discipline. He reached the last door at the end of the corridor, thicker than the rest, insulated against sound. When he opened it, the deeper truth waited inside. The room was smaller than expected and empty of furniture, but the walls were layered with materials designed to swallow sound entirely. No echo, no reflection. Silence sculpted into space. On one side stood a table with a single open file resting beneath a dim overhead lamp. Ethan approached it slowly. The name across the top of the document belonged to Veronica Hale, and beneath it sat a psychological evaluation dated years earlier, written by a private institution with enough legal power to make its diagnoses disappear. The language beneath the heading was clinical but unmistakable obsessive fixation, extreme control tendencies, projection of harm onto perceived possessions, a documented pattern of enforced dependency. The final note indicated recommended long-term supervision that had never occurred. Money had ended the record where medicine could not. Ethan closed the file carefully, as if not wanting to disturb what had clearly spent years buried. Now the clues took shape not as fragments, but as an architecture of intent. The child had not been abandoned in the bin as an act of desperation. He had been placed there as a variable, a message, or a mistake. He moved through the room once more and noticed the faint hand marks near the lower section of the padded wall, impressions pressed into the surface again and again, as if by a child too small to fight, but too aware to stop trying. Ranger paced once around the room, halting near the western edge where the wall carried a subtler vibration. Ethan pressed his ear against the surface. Beyond it, faint air movement whispered through hidden ducting that led deeper into the structure. He followed the path with his eyes to a concealed service hatch that blended nearly perfectly into the wall. Someone had built this room not only to restrain, but to disappear. Footsteps sounded above them then, slow and deliberate. Ethan froze as voices drifted faintly through the insulated ceiling, low and controlled. One belonged to Veronica. The other was unfamiliar and steady in the way professionals speak when risk has already been computed. The man's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to directing pain without witnessing it. The words filtered through the thickness just enough for key fragments to settle into meaning: preparation phase, subject relapse, dosage correction, retrieval window. Ethan did not need context to translate the language of experimentation. It had spoken the same grammar in every war zone he had ever crossed. Ranger's body went still. Every instinct focused upward, not in fear, but in alignment with Ethan's rising resolve. The child had not been reclaimed to be protected. He had been retrieved to be refined. Ethan withdrew without sound, sealing the door exactly as he had found it and retracing the route through corridor and slope with measured steps. Outside, the forest welcomed them back with the illusion of safety, while the estate behind remained deceptively still. When they reached the tree line, he allowed his breath to release at last in a slow, controlled exhale that carried more weight than relief. He did not speak on the return journey. Ranger did not need explanation anyway. The plan that had not quite existed at sunset now crystallized into form. Legal process would take years. The child did not have years. He did not even have days. Back at the harbor, the lights had shifted again, night traffic replacing the stillness of earlier hours. The town moved as though untouched by the machinery of suffering, turning quietly beyond its edges. Ethan stood near the water long enough for the cold to become honest against his skin. Somewhere beyond iron gates and soundproof walls, a child waited inside a place built to erase him piece by piece. Ethan reached again into his jacket pocket and felt the folded bandage against his palm. What he had entered as an observer, he would now return to as something far more dangerous. And this time, he would not wait for daylight. Rain slid through the forest south of Redwood Cove in silver threads, as the estate disappeared behind mist and shadow, its lights dimmed to a watchful gleam that mistook silence for safety. Ethan moved down the slope with Ranger at his side, every step measured between sound and shadow, the knowledge from what he had seen below those walls tightening inside him like a drawn wire. This was no longer reconnaissance. This was retrieval. The guards rotated in pairs, relying on habit more than awareness, their confidence born from years without resistance rather than from skill. Ethan waited for the gap between their paths, counting breath and heartbeat the way he used to before breaching a room on hostile soil, and when the moment opened, he moved through it without hesitation. The first guard never heard the sound that ended his watch, his body lowered gently into wet leaves by hands that had learned mercy only after mastering violence. The second turned just in time to feel Ranger's silent momentum take his balance away. The dog responding not with rage, but with precision, shaped by long nights of shared danger. They advanced in this manner through the perimeter, shadows folding into shadows, resistance collapsing before it could speak its own name. No alarm sounded, no voices carried. Only rain and breath marked their passing. The service entrance yielded again beneath Ethan's tools, and the slope swallowed them into the lower structure where cold metal and filtered air erased the presence of the forest above. Inside the corridor, he felt time compress back into the narrow, familiar tunnel of movement and intent. The first interior guard raised his head at the wrong second, surprise registering too late to summon anything else, and then the hall belonged again to silence. Ranger paused beside him only long enough to confirm stillness before moving on. The room, with restraints waited, empty. The table of syringes stood untouched, as if expecting the night's work to arrive on schedule. Ethan did not slow. The words he had overheard returned to him in fragments: preparation phase, retrieval window, dosage correction. That window was now closing. Voices drifted faintly from above the soundproofed ceiling. Veronica's controlled tone braided with another voice that carried no impatience and no empathy, only calculation. The final door at the end of the corridor resisted for half a second longer than the others, as if weighted by intention rather than hardware. When it opened, the room beyond answered every question Ethan had not yet voiced. The child lay on a narrow padded surface with restraints already fastened, thin limbs bound not for struggle, but for ritual. A syringe sat prepared near his arm, measured with care that pretended to be precision rather than cruelty. His eyes opened when Ethan entered, the recognition rising first as confusion and then as a fragile widening of hope that dared not speak out loud. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides and severed the restraints without a word. The boy did not cry. He did not speak. He simply leaned into the space where safety had last existed and trusted gravity to take him from the table into Ethan's arms. Ranger approached from the other side, lowering his head until it touched the child's leg with a softness that contradicted everything the guards outside believed they knew about him. Footsteps sounded beyond the insulated walls. The voices stopped. Something in the air shifted from routine to alarm. They moved immediately. Ethan wrapped the child inside his jacket and turned back towards the corridor. The first response team arrived seconds later from the upper level, too fast for coincidence, too coordinated for chance. The estate had been ready for intrusion, even if it had not believed in it. The corridor filled with movement. Ethan pressed the child closer and flowed through the space between bodies with the same economy that had once carried him through rooms stacked with explosives and shouting men. The second guard fell before he reached full aim. The third stumbled as Ranger took his legs out from beneath him and pinned him without sound. A shot cracked against the far wall, wild and panicked, shattering a light but missing flesh. Ethan no longer counted the number moving against him. He counted openings. They reached the service entrance under rising tension as the estate awakened above them. Behind, the sound of boots slipped back into chaos as alarm systems finally surrendered their denial. The slope welcomed them again with rain and falling leaves, the forest swallowing the noise into its own breathing. Ethan ran this time with the child held tight and unmoving against his chest, Ranger moving behind and beside him in alternating arcs that shut down pursuit before it could narrow into threat. Searchlights tore through the trees in wide white sweeps, cutting paths of artificial day through the rain, but Ethan stayed beneath their margins where shadow broke light into useless fragments. At the tree line beyond the southern ridge, he turned once more and saw the estate cut by its own alarms. Ordered calm ripped open into frantic geometry. Then he was gone. The forest closed. The night reclaimed what did not belong to it. The safe house lay several miles beyond town, where an old military supply road vanished into rocks and coastal brush, its existence forgotten by those who had never needed to hide what could not be lost. The structure was small, unmarked, built into the bluff with no windows, no signs, and no fingerprints in any public ledger. Ethan eased the door shut behind them and let the locks reset into their quiet, layered hum. Inside, warmth rose slowly from generators and timed heaters, the only sound the steady wind pressing against stone and metal like distant tide. He lowered the child onto a narrow bed made not for comfort, but for survival, and knelt beside him as the boy's shaking finally announced itself in full, silent waves traveling through his small frame. Ranger settled nearby without command, body forming a living barrier between the bed and the door. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor the child moved. Then the boy's hand lifted weakly and found Ethan's sleeve, not gripping, but anchoring, as if to test whether the world still answered touch. Ethan stayed exactly where he was and let the connection remind him that extraction was only the first step in any rescue that mattered. Somewhere in the distance, engines moved across the coastal road, police responding late to alarms that would soon be counted as another security failure in a place that dealt almost exclusively in hidden errors. Ethan remained with the child until exhaustion finally pulled him into an uneasy sleep, his breathing shallow but unbroken. Only then did Ethan rise and step toward the communications table along the far wall. He did not transmit yet. The network he would soon wake moved faster than local law and carried longer shadows. What had happened beneath the estate was not finished by removing one victim. It had only exposed the architecture that built more. He looked once more at the child curled under the dim light, and then at Ranger, who waited near the door with eyes open and unblinking, already anticipating the next movement before it asked to be named. Outside, rain continued to fall without memory of the cruelty it had witnessed. Somewhere beyond the forest and the collapsed illusion of safety, the minds that had designed the rooms below the estate were already adjusting, already calculating loss and recovery in the same breath. Ethan shut down the last light, and let darkness return to the safe house as a defensive ally rather than a threat. The boy was no longer inside the walls that had tried to erase him, but the hands that built those walls were still free. Dawn stretched pale light across the outer coastline as fog thinned over abandoned warehouses east of Kingsport Harbor, a place where tides hid more stories than they revealed. Ethan left the safe house before sunrise, not with haste, but with the stillness of a man who already knew the end of the road was near. Ranger moved beside him with the quiet certainty of a partner who sensed the shift from rescue to reckoning. The data taken from the estate's hidden servers had spoken in numbers and coded transfers, but beneath every transaction lay one name, repeated with surgical precision and absolute authority: Dr. Marcus Vaughn. Kingsport had once trusted Vaughn. Years ago, his clinical research had been praised for breakthroughs in neurological recovery, and somewhere along that path, recognition had begun to rot into obsession. Ethan found him now through the same cold channels that once tracked weapons across borders. Vaughn's private laboratory was not registered on any medical grid. It existed beneath a shell company that cleaned money as efficiently as it erased people. The warehouse stood dormant from the outside, rusted and forgotten. Yet Ranger's posture changed the instant they crossed the invisible boundary where secrecy always leaves a scent behind. Inside, the lower level revealed its truth layer by layer. Medical bays disguised as storage rooms. Steel restraints polished with the care of a craftsman. Observation glass darkened on one side only. This was not a place for healing. This was infrastructure for ownership. Ethan advanced through the silent corridors while Ranger scouted ahead with measured patience, not driven by fury, but by the weight of memory, carried in bone and instinct. A guard turned the corner too late and dropped without alarm. Another reached for a radio that never found his fingers again. Ethan left no signature of rage behind him, only removal. At the core laboratory, Vaughn stood alone before a monitor wall, watching live feeds from dormant sites as if absence itself were part of the experiment. He did not turn when Ethan entered. His voice came first, steady and untroubled, acknowledging disruption as one acknowledges weather. When he finally faced Ethan, there was no plea, no denial, only appraisal, as if measuring another variable that had arrived sooner than expected. He spoke of capacity, of control, of fragile minds too weak to survive unshaped. He spoke as if suffering were not inflicted, but harvested. In his world, pain was only a tool awaiting proper calibration. Ethan did not answer with ideology. He answered with evidence. The extracted data rose across the monitors, unsealing years of archived violations, transfers, and silent disappearances. Vaughn's calm fractured when his own system turned witness against him. He moved for a concealed fail-safe without glancing away from Ethan, but Ranger was already between hand and intent, body blocking the reach that thought it still mattered. Vaughn stumbled back, not in fear of harm, but in disbelief that something not human had predicted his movement before he had named it himself. The security doors collapsed seconds later under external pressure. Federal units flooded the perimeter with weapons trained and warrants signed long before dawn. Vaughn did not resist them. His war had never been fought directly. As he was taken, Ethan saw not defeat, but calculation, retreating inward to search for another angle that no longer existed. The network did not fall in one motion, but unraveled in hours as associated labs were breached and evidence spilled into daylight that could no longer be contained below ground. By nightfall, the story was already shifting public narrative from accident to conspiracy. But Ethan did not stay for the aftershocks. He returned to the cliffs where the safe house waited behind stone and shadow. Inside, the boy remained asleep under steady watch, unaware that the hands which had defined his fear were now bound by law. Ranger lifted his head at Ethan's return and released the quiet breath he had been holding since dawn. Ethan knelt beside the bed and watched the child breathe, light and unbroken. The war that mattered most had ended before it ever became public. Yet even as silence returned, Ethan understood something deeper than victory. What awaited the boy beyond rescue would be harder than anything they had taken him from. Healing would be slower than extraction. Trust would not arrive on command. Beyond the cliffs, the ocean shifted under starlight as if carrying away the wreckage of what had failed. But inside the shelter, the boy stirred for the first time without terror in his movement, and Ethan knew the next battle would not be fought in shadows or gunfire. It would be fought in waking hours, in quiet rooms, and in the space between memory and tomorrow. Morning settled gently over the small coastal town north of Kingsport, where wind carried the smell of salt and pine into quiet streets that had never learned to fear footsteps. The boy had been here for 3 months now, living in a modest home where laughter no longer sounded like something dangerous. Ethan stood on the porch with Ranger at his side and watched the child through the open doorway as he finished breakfast with the family that had learned his habits slowly and without demands. The man of the house spoke softly as he poured milk. His wife answered with steady warmth, and the boy listened without shrinking. No one here asked him to explain the past. They only asked what he liked, what he wanted, what made him feel safe. Ethan had chosen them carefully through channels that valued quiet backgrounds more than perfect records. They were ordinary in a way that did not invite attention, carrying their own losses without letting those losses become identity. The woman had once buried a son younger than the boy. The man had spent years believing he had nothing left to protect. Neither of them tried to replace what the boy had lost. They simply stood where fear used to stand and refused to move away. When the boy noticed Ethan at the door, he froze for one fragile second, the old reflex rising, then dissolved as he ran forward without hesitation. He did not stop when he reached Ethan. He climbed into his arms as if distance had never learned how to exist between them. Ranger pressed in close, tail moving slowly against the porch rail, anchoring the moment in something steady and familiar. Ethan said nothing. Words had never been part of what saved the child. He only held him and let time pass the way it was meant to pass, without counting. Later, as the boy returned to the warmth of the house, Ethan stepped back into the space that belonged to him again, the thin line between duty and attachment that he had learned to walk long before this child ever entered his life. A vehicle waited at the edge of the road with its engine already quiet and ready. Orders had come at dawn. Another deployment, another edge of the world that required silence and precision, and men who did not hesitate when hesitation had consequences. The man of the house joined Ethan by the gate, not to ask for promises, but to acknowledge the weight of leaving. He did not speak of gratitude in grand language. He spoke only once, telling Ethan that the boy now slept through the night without screaming. That was enough. The woman stood behind him with her hands folded and her voice steady when she told Ethan the boy had learned how to draw trees. Nothing more, no explanations, only signs that the war inside the child was finally laying down its weapons, one piece at a time. Ethan knelt once more in front of the boy and placed a small wrapped box into his hands. Inside was a simple compass, no markings that named where it had come from, only a quiet needle that always returned to north. He told the child that whenever he felt lost, he could look at it and remember that directions existed even when fear tried to hide them. The boy nodded solemnly, without fully understanding, but fully believing. Ranger watched the exchange with the calm patience of an old sentinel who had stood through worse storms and survived not because he did not feel pain, but because he did not abandon what mattered when pain arrived. When Ethan finally turned toward the waiting vehicle, the boy did not cry out. He stood on the porch holding the compass to his chest as if it were a living thing and raised one hand not in goodbye, but in promise. The road carried Ethan and Ranger back into the machinery of war, where the horizon no longer opened gently and days were measured again by movement and threat. Months passed before the next return. Each time Ethan brought something small, a book, a hat, a toy carved from unfamiliar places. Each time the boy grew a little taller, his voice stronger, his trust quieter and deeper. They did not speak of what had been taken from him. They spoke only of what was being built. On the year's final visit, snow fell lightly over the town in a way that softened every sound. The boy ran through the yard with Ranger at his heels, laughter trailing behind him like something alive. Ethan stood watching from the steps, unable to name the unfamiliar weight in his chest that was neither sorrow nor relief, but the fragile space where both had learned to coexist. When duty called again, Ethan left, as he always did, without ceremony and without the illusion that leaving meant absence. The boy did not stand at the road this time. He stood inside the window wrapped in lamplight, safe without needing to be seen. Ethan did not wave back. He only touched 2 fingers to the compass in his own pocket that matched the one he had given away long ago. Beyond the town the road widened and the horizon grew severe again, but behind him a life continued without alarms, without locked doors, without needles or restraints. A life made ordinary by people who had chosen to stay. And somewhere between the battlefields of the world and the quiet length of a child's future, a promise held its shape without needing either of them to speak it out loud. This story reminds us that miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, through the hands of someone willing to sacrifice, through the loyalty of a faithful companion, and through love that refuses to give up. God does not always stop the storm, but He always sends someone into it, so we do not face the darkness alone. In our daily lives, many of us carry silent burdens, hidden wounds, and quiet fears. If that is you today, remember this: God still sees you. His miracles are still moving, even when you cannot yet see them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope. Leave a comment with Amen as a prayer of faith. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of courage, healing, and God's quiet power together. May God bless you and your family, guard your hearts, give you peace in hard times, and light your path wherever you may walk.